Hey, happy Halloween 2021. So, in this episode, we're actually going to have a pretty practical and serious talk. I want to talk about this concept that is called burning through karma. And it has very much to do with tackling the issue of desire and craving in your life and how to go about that. This is going to help many of you who are pursuing spirituality, who are young in your 20s and maybe 30s, but are really overlooking some important considerations when it comes to spirituality on the one hand and then materialism on the other hand. So this concept of burning through karma, what does it mean? And don't take this too literally. This is not some sort of scientific theory. This is just, it's a loose sort of metaphor, you might say. Basically, like I teach a lot of deep spiritual stuff. And many of you guys who watch me are in your 20s and 30s. And one of the challenges that I see with you guys is that because I'm talking about these lofty metaphysical things like God and love and consciousness and awakening and so forth, that then you tend to just pursue it simply because Leo is talking about it and it's the cool thing to do, the right thing to do, the highest truth or the highest good or whatever to pursue. And while that is technically correct, the problem is that your psyche might not be prepared to pursue it because, as they say, you might have karma that you need to burn through first. And so what this just means is it means that, look, you have basic material needs and cravings and desires that are motivating you as the sort of biological animal being that you are, that most of us are. We're talking about cravings for food, for money, for sex, for approval, for fame, for success, for materialistic possessions. Maybe it's having a house or having a sports car or going on a beautiful vacation to some, Bahama resort or going skydiving or scuba diving, like this kind of stuff, right? The sort of fun, adventurous kind of stuff that ordinarily, if you would ask a person, like, what does a good life look like? And let's say they have no idea what spirituality is or any of these deep philosophical ideas, then to them, a good life would just be like a very adventurous, fun life where you're successful, you're famous, you have plenty of money, you have financial freedom to do whatever you want, you have cars and you have friends and you can party and you can enjoy yourself. People imagine this to be the best life possible. But of course, now when I get to you and I start brainwashing you with all these spiritual ideas, you start to realize that, well, the best life possible is not that. That's an illusion. That's not the best life possible. And then what can happen is that you can swing your pendulum in the opposite direction to the point where you poo-poo all material pursuits. And then any actual cravings or materialistic needs that you have inside of you for financial stability or for friends or for sex or romantic relationships or maybe even for marriage and children, like maybe you have these cravings inside of you, but just because you've been brainwashing yourself with spiritual ideas of asceticism and detachment and non-materialism, this kind of stuff, and letting go and surrender and not chasing and not manipulating reality too much, right? These sorts of spiritual concepts, you can swing your pendulum in the opposite direction to the point where you neglect these aspects of your life. And for some people, the ascetic lifestyle might be appropriate. But generally speaking, I would say that's a minority of people, a tiny minority of people. Maybe less than 1% of people are suited to the ascetic, mystic lifestyle, where you eschew all of these things that I was just mentioning and just go straight for awakening. Something sort of like the classic, Ramana Maharshi case, where the guy was like a teenager and basically he was already so conscious and wise that he wasn't even interested in materialistic pursuits. He wasn't interested in women. He wasn't interested in money. He wasn't interested in business. He wasn't interested in having a family. He was just interested in basically in contemplating what death is and just awakening. And then that's what his whole life became. But people, you have to understand that this is a very exceptional human being. You are probably not this human being. If you're this kind of human being, you're not listening to me. You don't need to listen to me. You're already out there doing it, and you probably are more conscious than I am. So why are you even listening to me? So for the majority of you who are listening to me, especially you youngsters, I want to make sure that you have one foot on the ground and that you keep yourself realistic as you go about developing yourself. The reality is that most of us have animalistic cravings that we need to somehow work through. And this is what is called burning through one's karma. Now, whatever the metaphysics of it is, you could say that, from past lives, you were kind of working your way up, and now through this life, you're still working your way up, and you're still maybe not ready for a full, a straight path to awakening. But I don't really care, what the actual physical explanations of this are, whether you have past lives or not. Just the reality is that you probably have basic needs that you need to satisfy first before you're ready to do really deep spiritual work. And really, the best time to satisfy those needs are when you're young, in your 20s and 30s. And so I want to share some insights from my own personal lessons that I got, my own personal life experiences here, which will maybe help to shed some light on what you're going through, because I know a lot of you guys are going through this. So basically, the way it worked in my life is that I had a certain unusual set of priorities that I focused on. So when I was in my teens, I focused a lot on my sense of life purpose and what my career would be, and my academics and my education. So I knew that I wanted to have a great career, and for that I knew I needed to have a great education. So I put all of my skill points and sort of time and energy into that, to the point where I neglected a lot of stuff like socializing, having a lot of friends, sleeping around, having girlfriends, this sort of stuff. I deliberately ignored this. It's not that I couldn't have done these things, it's that I was more interested and had a higher priority in my education. And then as I got good at education, another priority arose, which was philosophy. I discovered philosophy, and I started to study philosophy, and I started to just contemplate life deeply for my own self, metaphysics, epistemology, this sort of stuff, asking the big questions. And so that became a big priority for me. That was more important to me than chasing girls. And so that's what I focused on. And then through university, usually when people go to university, they party, they go drinking, they go to various kinds of dances and clubs and bars and this sort of stuff. A lot of folks will actually spend more time socializing in university and having sex and chasing girls and whatever else, being in relationships, than they do on the academics. So I deliberately ignored all of that and focused completely on academics because I knew that that was important for my life purpose. So I did that. And then after I graduated from university, I had to work extra hard to start my career. It was the beginning of my career. So I worked for a few years on that. Then I got my first job, and I basically got my dream job as a game designer. And that seemed to be going well. But then within about a year, I realized that this is still not really what I wanted. What I really wanted was to work for myself, to be fully creatively autonomous, not beholden to any boss or any corporation. And so for that, I had to start my own business. So then I spent the next 3 years or so really working hard 100% on my business. And so during this whole time, I was neglecting, for example, the social aspects of my life. Now, there's pros and cons to this. The pros is that I got an amazing education. The pros is that I was able to really work on my career, and I was able to build a great business, which made me financially independent. And I knew how important that was to me because that gave me the thing I valued the most, which was creative autonomy. I could basically do any kind of work that I wanted to do. That's what I wanted the most. That meant more to me than having girls, relationships, romance, friends, or anything else. So that's what I focused all my energy into. And I got it. But then after about 3 years of doing business there, I started to realize that my life was out of balance. I was neglecting the social aspects. I was neglecting the romantic aspects of my life, and I was starting to feel that, right? So what happens is that when you neglect certain aspects of your life, a craving builds up there, a deep craving, a deep desire for that thing that you've been neglecting or that you've been ascetical towards. And in a certain sense, for the first 25 years of my life, I was like basically like a monk. Because I was so focused on my life purpose. And there was a lot of great stuff that, in a sense, that built the foundation for my life. But also, on the other hand, there were sacrifices that were made there because certain things like socializing and romantic relationships and dating and this sort of stuff, this stuff is actually better learned when you're young. There's actually a certain period in your life where you're supposed to, it's sort of like the ideal window to be learning that stuff, which is basically like from age, I would say 20 to 40, or maybe even 35, like while you're young, handle your romantic stuff. And in a certain sense, that was the con there, is that I started late. And then because of that, there were certain, I had to work extra hard to solve that, because you can't solve something like that, that lack of experience, you can't solve it overnight or even in a single year, right? Because people who were doing this since high school, they've gotten 10, 20 years of experience. Meanwhile, I was working on my business, this sort of thing. So then what happened for me is after my business was reasonably successful and I felt financially comfortable, then I shifted and I put a lot of energy and attention. I got into pickup. I shifted into learning to socialize, going out to bars and clubs and so forth. I hadn't even been to a bar or a club in my entire life up to that point. That's how focused I was on what was truly important to me. And so I did that, but I had certain deficiencies. It was difficult to change that, because in a certain sense, when you put your mind in a single focused way on one thing, like meditation or enlightenment or business or whatever, it's almost easier. I mean, it is easier. It is much easier to get success that way than it is to be focusing on multiple things at once and trying to get them all right. And then I did that for a few years, and then I started Actualized.org, and I worked on Actualized.org because Actualized.org was a new business. I was really passionate about it. Then I spent the next 5 or 8 years working really hard on Actualized.org, again, sort of neglecting the social and romantic aspects of my life. And during this time that I was developing Actualized.org, the 8 years that I was working on Actualized.org flew by so fast, because it wasn't that I was just pumping out content every single week, which I was basically for 8 years, but it's also that I had to be learning so much, because I felt such an obligation to my audience to not mislead them and to inform them with the best insights that I could. So I had to be reading a lot, researching a lot, meditating a lot. I got into spirituality during this point, got very serious about psychedelics during this point. Psychedelics were a whole tangent that I wasn't really expecting, that was basically like a detour within my life, and really transformed how I see reality and what my priorities were and so forth. And in a sense, I got into spirituality, and I just started doing it, not really knowing where it's going to take me. And it took me into incredible directions that I didn't even anticipate. But at the same time, I realize now that there are certain aspects of my life that I still haven't burnt the karma through yet to the end. And so specifically with me, it's in the romantic relationship domain. So what as I was focused on Actualized.org over the last 5 or 8 years, it's not that I didn't have romantic relationships. I did, but they weren't like a focus of mine. And they didn't meet my cravings and what I really wanted out of them. So what I find now is that what I have a craving for is, and this is something, so here's the lesson for you, is that you have to be very honest with yourself about what your cravings are. What do you genuinely crave in life? Because there's a lot of times that you might crave something, but then society or somebody else or even some spiritual teacher, or maybe you even perceive that Leo, myself, am somehow judging you for what you crave. Like maybe what you just crave is money, or what you crave is sex, or what you crave is drugs, or what you crave is food, or what you crave is, something like that. That's pretty shallow like that. And basically the lesson of this episode is you have to be honest with yourself. This is part of what self-honesty is about, part of what introspection is about. And really, this is part of spirituality here, is if you have materialistic cravings, be honest about what those are. If you've been living your whole life in poverty and what you really crave is to just have some financial freedom and to be able to buy a nice car and to be able to, pay for your kids so that you don't have to keep making excuses to them for why you can't buy them the kind of gifts they want for Christmas or whatever. Or you want to buy yourself some nice clothes that you normally wouldn't have been able to afford, but you want to treat yourself materially to these things, then that's where you're at in life. Be careful trying to pretend that you're more spiritual or more detached than you really are. The reality is that you have those cravings and desires. Those are your particular attachments. We might say that's your karma. And that's now something you got to deal with. And you need a realistic strategy for how to deal with that. So there's really, the question here is, what are the strategies for dealing with cravings and desires? Ultimately, what we want to do with low consciousness or sort of base animalistic cravings and desires is the materialistic ones, is we want to exhaust them. And as we exhaust them or transcend them, and there might be multiple ways of doing that, I'll talk about that in a second, then what we want to do is we want to transcend those to reach higher kinds of desires. So a base desire might just be having a lot of money or getting a lot of one-night stands. And then if you exhaust that, you can transcend to deeper and higher quality desires, like the desire to be creative, for example, or artistic, or the desire to have free time just to meditate and introspect or to do philosophy. And then you could even transcend those into even higher desires, right? Ultimately, if you transcend everything, you're gonna reach the desire for total selflessness. That will be your highest desire. So the more you transcend selfishness and materialism, the more purified your psyche becomes and your consciousness, and the more your desires shift towards helping others, towards communion with others, towards a deep intimacy with other, towards a merging of self and other, towards becoming more selfless and more loving and more godlike, until eventually you become metaphysical love, you become God. The problem, though, is trying to get there too quickly without deeply exploring and exhausting, burning through the karma that you have. Because there's a tendency to want to kind of just like leapfrog all that stuff and just get to the top of the pyramid, so to speak. Now, for certain people, for certain spiritually talented, attuned, exceptional people, they can do that. They don't necessarily need to go out there and earn a bunch of money and get very famous and have a bunch of sex in order to ultimately realize that none of that makes them happy. Buy 10 sports cars and that doesn't do it for you. And then finally, then you reach God. For some exceptional people, that's not necessary. They can just go straight to God. So like Ramana Maharshi, for example. But that's probably not you. And that's not even me. And so what I've been coming to grips with lately is I've done a lot of spirituality over the last 5 years, let's say. But I noticed that there's still certain things that I want out of materialistic life, out of this dream that I'm in. There's certain experiences that I'm sort of missing that I want to have, that I know that I will regret not having. And so for me specifically, again, what that is I want, it's not just sex, and it's not just one-night stands. What I'm interested in is I want like a very deep, profound romantic experience with a woman. And I mean, I've had certain levels of it, but you have to realize how many levels of depth there are to this. Like a profound like sexual intimacy is how I would characterize this craving. Not just physical intimacy, but of course physical, but also emotional and even spiritual and ultimately metaphysical. And so I feel like I haven't scratched that itch deeply enough within myself. And I feel like that's holding me back. So what I've noticed in myself through introspection is that I could like ignore that craving and just sort of put it in the back of my mind and just sort of like focus towards doing deep spiritual work. And that's what I've been doing over some number of years. But then lately I've been rethinking that strategy, and I've been thinking like, I'm still young. I'm still relatively young. Is that the right strategy? Or is the better strategy here to actually recognize that I have these cravings within myself, and rather than trying to like deny them or demonize them or judge them and say that they're wrong or that they're low consciousness or that they're too materialistic or whatever, actually, maybe the higher spiritual move here is to admit, to accept, and then to actually work through them, not to just ignore them or to deny them. And this actually is a very high, in a certain sense, counterintuitive move of self-love, right? Because look, if you really loved yourself, you would also accept and love your shadow and your dark side and any kind of materialistic cravings and desires that you have, and you would want yourself to satisfy those in a deep way such that you can transcend them, not in a sort of a rushed way where it's like, yeah, okay, quickly, get it over with, like get it over with. Go have sex with a few people and just get out of your system. Like, not like that. I mean, like, if you really, truly loved yourself, think about God's love for you. God's love for you. If God truly loved you, you might say like, well, Leo, God wants me to quickly realize that I'm God. Maybe not. Maybe what God wants for you is really because the love is so deep that God accepts your agenda so much as its own that God wants you to want what you want. In a sense, that's what true love is. True love is not to demand of the other to do what you need them to do to reach your level. True love, a deeper love than that, would be a love where you accept the place that consciousness is in. That conscious being is at a certain level, and it can't realize the higher levels until it exhausts its lower levels of consciousness. And therefore, if it wants something petty, then you love that being enough that you are okay with it wanting something petty. Like if your child wants some candy. See, one attitude you could take is you could say, no, don't eat any candy. It's bad for you. It'll rot your teeth and it'll make you fat. Like you could take that attitude. And you might say, well, that's loving because in a certain sense, you're looking out for the child. That's one way to look at it. But another way to look at it is that still, it's not the deepest love. The deepest love would be to actually put yourself in the child's shoes. Don't look down at the child. What if you were the child? What if you had those cravings and you wanted some of that sugar? Maybe what the child needs is not a lecture from you about how bad sugar is and why he shouldn't eat it, but maybe what the child needs is actually some like deep compassion and a realization that this child, this conscious being needs to actually experience for itself what sugar tastes like to satisfy that craving. And even if he gets addicted to it, maybe he needs that too. That's also part of his evolution. And then also, this conscious being needs to learn the downsides for itself, not to be lectured about how bad sugar is, but have the child eat the sugar and then realize what the downsides of it are through direct experience. So that then the child can awaken to something beyond the craving for sugar. You see, this would be sort of a strategy of burning through the sugar karma, we might say. And so really there's two strategies for dealing with cravings and desires. One is to try to ignore them, suppress them, and ultimately let them go. And it is possible, and I want you to always remember this, that whatever craving or desire you have in life, you should be open to the idea that it's always possible just to let it go. Just let it go. Whatever it is you want that you think you're lacking, just let it go. And in a certain sense, this is the most spiritually evolved and direct path towards your evolution, is just let it go if you can. But that's a big if. if you can. If you want to. See, you have to want to. Because if you do it out of a sort of a moralistic place, like a lot of religious people will do this. Stage blue religious people is they will try to, avoid sinful behavior because it's wrong and they're going to go to hell. And there's some sort of they feel like there's an external moralistic pressure put upon them to not behave in sinful or evil ways. Well, that's definitely not going to work because that's going to lead to guilt and suppression and repression, and that's a recipe for a lot of bad stuff. So the other approach is to actually recognize that you have this craving within you, and then actually to, in a non-self-destructive manner, to go about satisfying it. With the idea that you will pursue it for some number of years. Hopefully you will reach the results you want. You will experience the fruits. You will experience what it's like to satisfy that desire. And you will also experience that the satisfaction of that desire does not make you complete or happy in some ultimate sense. You're still going to be facing with unhappiness. And there's still going to be many problems in your life, and you're still not going to feel complete. And the reason that is because what you ultimately desire is you desire infinite love. You desire God. You don't just desire some sex or a relationship or some children or some money or a sports car. You desire something much deeper than that, but you yourself aren't ready to really face your true desire, and you're not really ready to surrender all of your attachments yet to reach that highest level of selflessness and love. So you have to work your way up to it in baby steps. So that's the second method. I think the second method is much more realistic for many people. And I want you to think about your own situation in life, whatever it is for you, whether it's food, sugar, sex, money, houses, cars, relationships, whatever. Get clear about what you really crave, and get clear about what things are you willing to surrender without experiencing them, and then what things are you unwilling to surrender. What desires and cravings are you simply unwilling to surrender without first experiencing them? Like, for example, let's say you're a virgin, and I tell you, hey, you can be totally happy and complete. You can experience profound levels of metaphysical joy and bliss and ecstasy beyond anything that a human orgasm can give you, that beyond any sexual experience that you can get. I can tell you that, and that's technically true. And so in that sense, you might say, okay, well, then I don't need sex. I don't need to pursue sex. I can just shortcut that and just go straight to what Leo is talking about here with this sort of metaphysical ecstasy and spiritual ecstasy. But then you also have to ask yourself, yeah, but am I willing to never have a sexual experience in my entire life? Is that something that would sit well with me? Or would that bug me for the rest of my life? Would I regret not doing it? And it's not that you're fooling yourself into thinking that having sex one time will somehow complete you or solve all your problems. It won't. It's obvious that it won't. But on the other hand, if you're so lacking in that department, maybe it's not so wise to just treat that lack flippantly as though it doesn't matter, as though it's not important. Maybe it is important. And no one can tell you what's important. It's all about you. What are your standards? What kind of experiences do you want to have in this life? So for me personally, even though that I know that I'm in a dream here, and that no particular experience that I have will ever satisfy me or please me in any lasting way in this world, in this dream, there are still certain experiences that I want to have. And so, namely, I want to have some very deep physical, emotional, and spiritual, and even like metaphysical, intimate romantic experiences. And I feel like if I just imagine myself on my deathbed, not having had what I know I can have in this department, I would feel like my life was not fully actualized. Something would be missing. And yet at the same time, I'm not fooling myself into thinking that if I have some of these romantic experiences, that all of a sudden that will like solve everything in my life, you see? So it's a little bit subtle and nuanced here. I'm not fooling myself into thinking that if I have these experiences that now all of a sudden, like the spiritual work is no longer important, I can just ignore that. No. In fact, the way I frame it in my mind is that I need to burn through this karma, have these experiences that I want to have, satisfied to a certain degree, and then also realize that it still won't fully satisfy me. And then I can go to really deep spiritual levels with my work. And if I try to ignore this, then it's going to hold me back from going to the deepest spiritual levels that I could go to. So that's sort of the conclusion that I reached for myself. Again, I'm not saying this is something that applies to you. I'm just giving this to you as an example so that you can, try to apply this to your life, see in which areas of your life this applies. Maybe it applies with your finances. Maybe it applies with your art. For example, on the one hand, you want to pursue awakening in God and love. On the other hand, you just want to be artistic. And you find that there's some tension between those two. Like, should you focus more of your energy on your art or on your meditation, your spiritual work? And you find that when you focus your attention on the meditation and spiritual work, in a certain sense, that's like the right move, but in a certain sense, it doesn't really satisfy you as much as if you focused on your art right now for the next 5 or 10 years. And so my point here being is that when you're still young, when you're in your 20s and 30s, and maybe even 40s, there's something to be said to investing that time on tackling materialistic desires that you have. Try to get that out of your system as early as possible. I see that some of you who are following me are sort of taking the opposite approach, which is what you're doing is you're sort of like neglecting all the material aspects and you're just going straight to psychedelics and straight to meditation and self-inquiry and yoga and non-duality. And you're still maybe only 20 years old or 25 years old or 30 years old. And I think that this is dangerous. Now, for some of you, it's right. And if it works for you, it clicks for you, great, do it. But for others of you who are trying to do this and you're seeing that it's failing, you're not getting the results you want, I would suggest that maybe you need to rethink your strategy and that really you got to get honest with yourself about your materialistic cravings and desires and needs and really focus on those first. Focus on those for 5, 10, 15 years, satisfy those, build a business, do your art, develop your career, handle your finances, move away from your family so that you're independent, you're not under their, under their heel. Have the romantic and sexual relationships you want, develop the friendships you want, go socialize, go party, go have fun, do this sort of stuff. Get it out of your system. And then maybe when you're older, now once you get that stuff out of your system, then there will come a natural place in your life where you say, well, I've done this and I've done that, I've traveled, I've ate great food, I've made good money, I've had some fame, I've had some success and this sort of stuff. And okay, I've done that stuff, it's great, fine, but now I want something more. And then I think that's really when your spiritual work will produce the most fruits. And in a certain sense, to pursue awakening and spirituality too early in your life is, in a certain sense, doing things backwards. Now, again, for some people, it's appropriate, but for most people, I think it's backwards, actually. Because there is that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and self-transcendence is at the very top of the hierarchy for a good reason. So you want to satisfy your lower needs first, for most people. Now, again, this doesn't mean you have to do it this way. It just means for most people, this is probably their karma, and what they need to do is, burn through a good amount of it in their 20s and 30s before they can get really serious about spiritual work. Now you might wonder, well, but Leo, what makes the difference? How about, some people who pursue like sex or luxury or travel or money? It seems like some people, maybe even most people, pursue that stuff and they get stuck in it. They get lost in it and they end up chasing money or sex or whatever, like for their entire lives. It doesn't seem like they exhaust it. What's the difference between a person who pursues sex and has sex for 5 or 10 years, gets a lot of it out of his system, and then moves on to other things, versus a person who becomes a sex addict and just has sex, chasing women endlessly, philandering endlessly for the rest of his life? What's the difference between those two? How do we avoid this second situation? How do we actually make sure that when we're pursuing and satisfying our desires, that they're actually getting satisfied and then transcended, rather than just an endless pursuit of the same thing over and over and over again? Like some people, some millionaires and billionaires, they just pursue more and more money. They're like 80, 90 years old and they're still just chasing money. Every day they're waking up thinking about how to make more money. But what's the point of all that money? You're going to be dead in 5 years. You don't need any more billions of dollars. You already got more than you can spend. What are you doing? So this is a question I've been pondering. It's a deep question. I recommend you contemplate it too, because I honestly, I don't know exactly the answer, but here I'll speculate a little bit with you. I think that honestly, some people are just so dense in their consciousness and they have so much karma, so to speak, to burn through, that in this lifetime, they're not going to burn through much of it. They're going to get stuck with sex, money, or whatever. I think that another important factor is that these people just don't, a lot of people simply don't have the theoretical foundation to know about the possibilities of even transcending these desires and what greater things lie beyond, right? So if you've been following Actualized.org and you've been studying my content, then you're in a rather unique situation, because I've talked a lot about the limitations of materialistic pursuits. And, if you've contemplated this stuff, and you introspected, you should notice how your chasing and pursuing of materialistic things never really fully satisfies you. And so as you apply consciousness to the fact that your selfish actions and your limited ways of pleasuring yourself, as you become more conscious, you realize that these things, they don't lead to the greatest satisfaction. And then you listen to me and I talk about things that are sort of higher forms of satisfaction, like spiritual satisfaction that you might get. Or if you've done psychedelics, you've experienced the kind of love, profound love and sense of completeness that you get on a psychedelic journey. And that puts your ordinary materialistic pursuits into a context, into their place. It shows you how petty they are, right? But I think that for most people who are out there pursuing materialistic things, they're roughly at spiral dynamic stage orange. They don't even know of the higher stages. They don't even know about green or yellow or turquoise. They don't know about transcending the ego. They don't know about spiritual ecstasy and bliss, right? They don't know about love. They don't know about God. They don't know about these things. They're not even in that person's mind. Like, take someone like Warren Buffett. I don't know. I really don't know much about his psychology or what he knows or doesn't know, but I just picture him as somebody who just like materialistically pursues more and more money for its own sake. I don't know how this makes him happy, but apparently it does somehow. I don't know why he's like 80 years old now and he's still not sick of pursuing money and just investing more and more. I would think he would have exhausted that by now, but apparently he hasn't. And why is that? Probably because he doesn't know that there's higher things. Because he's so stuck on just that one thing. Also, I think that people who are very, very good and talented in a narrow capacity at one thing, they can easily get stuck in that thing. So for example, if you're really, really good at investing, you can easily get stuck 80 years of your life just investing, because that's all you know, that's what you're best at. And you don't want to explore any other aspects of life really, because you wouldn't be very good at them as you are at investing. Or if you're really good with women, I know some guys like this who are just like players, like they're just naturally really good with women. They always were. And so for them, having lots of sex just comes very naturally and effortlessly. They're really good at it. It gives them a certain amount of pleasure. Of course, it never fully satisfies them, so they have to have more and more and more, hundreds of women. And then they just keep doing this into their 40s and 50s, and maybe their whole life they will just be doing this. That just might be because that's the easiest path for them. That's what they're really good at. And then for them to do something else, to find other higher pleasures, this might be, this might be very much out of their comfort zone, not something they're talented or gifted in. And they would have to work really hard at it, and it would be painful, and so they don't do it. They don't go in that direction. I think that also people with a lot of trauma, early trauma, that trauma can sort of twist and distort your psyche and get you stuck in certain ways, and then keep you stuck there in those patterns for the rest of your life unless you go and deeply heal that trauma and address it. And of course, that trauma usually is very difficult to heal. It's painful. People don't want to look at it. It's buried deep in the psyche. And so I think a lot of trauma contributes to people getting stuck. And that would require, years of therapy, years of psychedelic work, years of introspection. And for many people, it's easier just to avoid that and just to focus on the simpler pleasures of life as sort of a coping mechanism against that. But what I would say is that if you pursue the satisfying of some of your deepest desires, some of your genuine desires, with an attitude of mindfulness and consciousness, and you put it in the proper context, and also at the same time, you're studying spiritual theory and you're building this deep foundation that we build here with actualized content, and maybe you're exploring a little bit of psychedelics and you're still meditating a little bit, these sorts of things. And you understand that the pursuit of these desires is going to be a temporary thing. You're not fooling yourself into thinking that you're going to keep doing this for the rest of your life. In fact, you might sort of set like a rule for yourself, like, okay, I'm going to pursue business for the next 5 or 10 years. I'm going to exhaust that. I'm going to pursue money or fame for the next 5 or 10 years. I'm going to exhaust that. I'm going to pursue sex and relationships for the next 5 or 10 years. And I'm going to exhaust that craving. And then I'm going to move on to higher things. And by the way, when I say exhaust and move on to higher things, I'm not saying that, you have relationships for 10 years and then you stop having relationships after 10 years. I don't mean that. I just mean that you're going to get to a point where you're not needy and lacking in that thing anymore. Whatever is money, I'm not saying you make money for 10 years, then you stop making money. I'm saying you focus on money intensely for 10 years, maybe overcompensate for that, and then maybe your business stabilizes. You can still earn money, you can still do business, but then after that, that's no longer like a deep motivating thing for you. You move on to other things. Meanwhile, you still end up earning a little bit of money, right? Like you don't be realistic about how this works. And so in this way, you evolve. And also, you're aware of spiral dynamics. You're aware of developmental psychology. You're aware of the Susan Cook-Greuter 9 stages of ego development model that I talked about. With an episode series by that title. So you're aware of those stages, and you're sort of anticipating that basically, if you're sort of following this developmental psychology model of spiral dynamics or Susan Cook-Greuter, you're sort of expecting that every 5 years or so of active development will move you up one stage. 5 to 10 years, one stage. So maybe right now you peg yourself at blue or orange, so you kind of anticipate that, for the next 5 or 10 years, I'm going to move one stage from orange to green. And then another 5 or 10 years from green to yellow, and so forth. So as long as you're studying this theory and you're serious about your own evolution, I wouldn't worry too much about getting stuck chasing some desire for the rest of your life. I think that mostly happens with people who have a lot of trauma and who are overly specialized in that thing, and also they're not thinking deeply about metaphysics, spirituality, and all the foundational kind of principles that we talk about in this work. So I think if you're following that, then I wouldn't worry too much about that. And I would actually encourage you to allow yourself to accept, embrace, and to even love some of your cravings and desires, and to be honest with yourself about your need to satisfy those, and to burn through some of that karma. And also recognize that there are certain things that are best done when you're younger and other things that are best done when you're older. In fact, spirituality and meditation and awakening, we might say that these are actually more suited towards the second half of your life, not the first half of your life. Because in the first half of your life, you really have to master survival. That's what a lot of you are missing. You need to figure out a way to pay for yourself, to be independent of your family, to socialize, have friends, have intimate relationships because you crave those things. Like if you're like most people, you need to figure out your nutrition, your diet, your exercise regimen. You need to work on your health, make sure that your health situation is stable and balanced so you don't have problems there. If you have any kind of disorders, autoimmune issues, whatever, you got to fix those. A lot of those have to do with your diet and your lack of exercise. Success, this is the time to work on your success. If you have a feeling that you need to be artistic, this is the time to be artistic, because you're in your prime. In your 20s and 30s, you're at your prime intellectually in many ways. You're at your prime in terms of your energy levels, because after age 40, your energy levels are going to start to dip. Your cognitive capacities are going to start to dip. And also, like with sex specifically and romantic relationships, your 20s and 30s, this is the prime time. This is when you do it. Because the last thing you want, and this is sort of like where I was coming from thinking about this, is like, the last thing I want is to be some 60-year-old man who is very awake and conscious and spiritual, but on the other hand, I still have sexual cravings that I didn't satisfy when I was younger, and those are still lingering with me when I'm 60, and then I'm like a horny 60-year-old, right? Like this, and you actually see this with plenty of spiritual teachers, a lot of spiritual gurus and so forth, and monks. One of the problems with them is that because usually a monk goes into being a monk very early in life, in their 20s, and then they spend, like, let's say, all their 20s and 30s pursuing monkhood and sainthood and this sorts of stuff, being a yogi, and then they end up being like a great teacher in their 50s or 60s, but then you have all these sexual scandals that happen with these spiritual cults and so forth, because the bottom line is that some of these gurus and monks and yogis and so forth, they kind of went about the whole thing backwards. And then they spend their later half of their life trying to like satisfy some of those base sexual cravings. And I think that honestly, they still have those very powerful sexual cravings because they didn't satisfy them when they were a monk. And honestly, awakening and enlightenment may not be enough to satisfy you in that domain. It may not be enough. It can satisfy you in other ways, but you will still have those lingering sexual cravings that you didn't get out of your system. And maybe you'll have other sorts of cravings. Maybe you'll have a craving for money too, because you didn't pursue it when you were younger. So there is a certain wisdom to pursuing the base material things when you're in your first half of your life. Otherwise, you're going to end up as some like creepy 60-year-old who's all awake, but then like chasing 20-year-old girls because you didn't satisfy that when you were in your 20s and your 30s. And then that can become abusive, that can become toxic and kind of creepy and weird. And so like looking at my own life, I see myself like, I don't want to be in that situation. So I want to, and I want to be realistic with myself. Now, could I just sit down and tell myself, you know what, I'm just going to completely let go and surrender of any kind of cravings or desires that I have for any sexual or romantic experiences, any kind of intimacy, just let go of all of it and just go purely for the abstract metaphysical love. And that will be enough to satisfy me. I mean, I'd like to believe that's possible. But on the other hand, I'm also just human. I'm infinite, but I'm also human too, right? That's the conundrum. And so are you. You're infinite, but you're also human. And so your mind is corrupted with various kinds of attachments and limitations. You have a limited, finite mind, which is attached to a sort of an animal body. And that animal body has its cravings and needs. And you have to be realistic about those. In general, I think that the idea that you can transcend sexual craving through pure abstinence is a very flawed idea, and that for the majority of people, this will not work. That's also why I'm pretty much against the no-fap movement, because there's this sort of silly idea within the no-fap movement that you can just sort of will yourself to abstain from masturbation, and then that somehow you're gonna break that craving, and you're gonna transcend it through this abstinence and through being very kind of like strict with yourself. I don't think this works effectively. It's never really worked. The church has tried this. Various monastic traditions have tried this. And what ends up happening usually is it backfires. There are many stories that you can read of monks and celibate priests and so forth who try to abstain from sex because, you're not supposed to. It's not spiritual, so to speak. And then what ends up happening is that actually, even if those people are spiritual in other ways, those cravings don't go away. In fact, they intensify and they get perverted because they're being suppressed. They get perverted and they manifest themselves in perverted ways, in abusive ways, leading to molestation, rape, and all sorts of weird, creepy stuff like that. That is way worse than if they were just honest and allowed themselves to satisfy those cravings when they were younger in a healthy, reasonable way. Now, of course, you can always go overboard with the satisfaction of your cravings, and you can even destroy your life by chasing sex or drugs or money or fame or material possessions and luxury. You can destroy your life this way, so it's very much about balance. You have to find that balancing point. And you have to pursue the satisfaction of your desires in a mindful, conscious way. Consciousness is the key. I think a lot of people who pursue material pleasures, they do it unconsciously. And then it becomes, it just becomes like another habit, a compulsive habit. And so one area in my life where I have transcended desire and craving the most is when it comes to food. I used to be very addicted to food, the worst kinds of junk food when I was younger, because in my family, the notion of health food simply didn't exist. You would eat the greasiest, saltiest, fattiest, least healthy food that you could find because it tasted the best. That was the sort of family culture that I grew up in. And then I had to work really hard to change that within myself. And that took a process of like 10 years of rewiring my mind, retraining myself. But I'm at the point now where I still get cravings for sugar and sweet things, for example, and certain kinds of, guilty pleasure food. But generally speaking, I feel like I've transcended those cravings. And part of the reason that is, I think, is because what happened with me, the way I transcended my food cravings is basically I ate so much of the greasiest, saltiest, unhealthiest, worst food imaginable in my youth. I ate so much of that food that I basically became disgusted with myself and the consequences this was having on my body, on my physical appearance, on my self-esteem, on my confidence, on my sexuality, on my ability to attract girls, on my mental performance, on my mood and my feelings, my energy levels, all this stuff. I became so disgusted with the negative consequences of this that I reached certain tipping points in my life. There were multiple tipping points that I reached where I just like swore off junk food forever. And it was such a deep swearing off that I don't even crave it anymore. Like, for example, I haven't eaten pizza in probably 8 years. I hadn't eaten a slice of pizza. Not because I don't love it. I love pizza, ordinarily speaking. But I reached a sort of a tipping point where I became disgusted with eating pizza to the point where now I can walk by, a pizza parlor and they have these big juicy pizzas rotating right in front of the window. I can walk by it, I can look at it, I can kind of say, in my mind, I can be like, yeah, that looks kind of delicious. But on the other hand, I have no more craving for it. It's a very interesting phenomenon. I can appreciate it. I can almost want to eat the slice, but there's no more craving, and I don't really have to hold myself back the way I used to in the past. Similar situation, for example, with ice cream. I would love ice cream. I would, overeat buckets of ice cream to the point where I was just nauseous and disgusted with myself from eating so much ice cream. But then after doing that so many times, I became so disgusted that now, even though I still enjoy ice cream, I basically rarely partake in it. And if I do, it's gonna be moderate. It's not gonna be to the extent where I nauseate myself with it and I'm disgusted with myself. And that took a lot of failure and trial and error to reach that point in my psyche where something shifted like that. So I think similar things are possible, for example, with sexual cravings and with cravings for material things. I still have certain material cravings. I would say the biggest one would be like romantic intimacy. And you might not even say that that's material. I mean, in a certain sense, it's not material. Really what I crave is not sex. What I crave is like a deep spiritual intimacy with another human, with feminine energy, basically. You could call that material or not material, however you want, but still it's a craving. And so I kind of put it in the material category. It's a sort of an attachment. But I still, for example, enjoy nice things. I like to buy nice things sometimes. I like to buy nice clothes sometimes. But it's very I would say my relationship to all that is very healthy, in the sense that I don't go overboard. I don't waste a bunch of money here or there, and I don't fool myself into thinking that this is going to somehow make me happy, or that this will obviate the need for deep spiritual work that I plan to be doing in the future. So, anyways, these are just some thoughts on what it means to burn through karma. Think about how this applies to your own life. Be realistic with yourself. If you can surrender and let go certain cravings just without having to experience them, then do it. That's the most direct path. But if you can't, that's also okay. And consider this as part of your practice of self-love. Right? God's love for you is so profound that if you want to eat a bucket of ice cream to the point where you're just disgusted and you have a stomach ache and you're in a food coma for the next day from eating a gallon of ice cream, God's love for you is such that God wants you to experience that. And there is a higher wisdom there that when you do that, then that's where your consciousness truly starts to learn from direct experience why you shouldn't eat a bucket or a gallon of ice cream. Right? You sort of hit rock bottom. And that's honestly what happens with a lot of alcoholics and drug addicts, is at some point they hit rock bottom. Either they die or they hit a psychological rock bottom where they realize, like, if I keep going down this road, my entire life will be destroyed. And so I have to stop. And then they learn to stop. And then they learn to moderate themselves. Now, you have to be careful, with something like hard drugs. It's extra dangerous because you can easily kill yourself. You have more leeway when it comes to sex and food and chasing money and so forth. But still, you have to be careful, because you can waste decades of your life chasing this stuff if you're doing it in a compulsive, unconscious way and you don't properly contextualize. So what I recommend is that if you're going to pursue some of your, material desires and cravings, do it, but still keep learning the theory. Keep learning the theory, keep reading the books, keep a little bit of a spiritual practice going. You can still meditate an hour a day while you're pursuing whatever you're pursuing materially. You can still do a psychedelic once a month. And that psychedelic, for example, will help to keep your priorities straight. so that you understand and remember, you don't forget that this chasing of whatever material thing you're chasing, that it's not going to ultimately lead to the highest satisfaction for you. Psychedelics will show you that. They will get you to think deeply about your priorities. And so just what I recommend is that you maintain, even if you're going to be doing something material, like doing a business or pursuing money and fame, still maintain at least a little bit, an hour or two a day of some kind of spiritual practice, or just even spiritual study, or just reading spiritual books, or watching my videos, or watching somebody else's videos along the same lines as what we're talking about here, just to make sure you don't completely fall off track, right? And then also put this process into a larger context of like, this is part of your whole evolution, right? It's not that you're pursuing women or you're pursuing a car or a house for its own sake. You're seeing that that's part of your evolutionary process. And that puts it into a larger context. And you have sort of a plan in your life that, for the next 5 years, I'm going to be doing business. Then for the next 5 years, I'm going to be doing relationships. Then for the next 5 years, I'm going to be doing something else. And then I'm going to be evolving myself in this way. And I think if you do it like that, then realistically, for most people, this is the best way for them to evolve themselves. Telling the average person to just drop all of their cravings, all of their attachments, and go straight for God and love, this is not going to work for the majority of people. It has never worked. Throughout the history of mankind, it has never worked. This has been tried by spiritual and religious orders and cults and traditions for thousands of years. There have been ascetic monastic traditions. And what's the conclusion from all that? We have thousands of years of experience. The conclusion is that it works for a tiny percentage, less than 1% of people, and for normal people, it doesn't work. It's not sustainable. They don't have the spiritual giftedness for it. They have too much karma. They have too much baggage, or whatever. They're simply not wise enough to execute on that. And honestly, I don't know if I'm strong enough to execute on that like 100% directly. In the sort of in like the classic Buddha sense. The Buddha, just like the Buddha. The story of the Buddha is that he left his wife, he left his children, he left his palace and his kingdom, and he went for 7 years into the forest to meditate and to attain nirvana and enlightenment. That's very fucking radical. The reason that story is so powerful is precisely because almost nobody, that story doesn't apply to almost anybody. It's like supernatural. It's like being the Michael Jordan or the Kobe Bryant of baseball or basketball. Like that, the average person cannot ever become that good at basketball. They don't have that kind of drive, that motivation, that skill set, those genetics, that perfect combination of everything that is necessary to be able to achieve that level of world-class performance. So be careful comparing yourself to these sorts of mythical figures like Ramana Maharshi or the Buddha or Christ or something like this. You're not like this. If you were, you wouldn't be watching my videos. And I'm not like that either, right? I'm not as spiritually strong or maybe courageous or as motivated as those people. So I have to do spirituality in my way, whatever suits my situation. I can only progress at my own rate. So you have to be careful comparing yourself to people who you are not like. All right, so there you go. There you have it. Now you understand what burning through karma means. I'm gonna use that phrase in the future. I've been actually wanting to explain this phrase for a while because I like using it. It's just a quick little phrase that you can use to help people who are stuck. And sometimes what happens is that when you pursue spirituality too early, too soon, without handling your basic survival, what happens is that you can actually get very bad consequences. You can misapply the teachings. I've spoken about that in the past. You can even become suicidal or depressed. You can get ahead of your skis, or you can just put yourself into a very bad material situation where you let's say you even attain your spiritual pursuits and fruits. You attain all those, but then like your life conditions are very, very bad. You don't have a house to live in. You're homeless. You don't have a career. You don't know how to make money. You don't know how to socialize. You're very awkward with people. You're sexually inexperienced. This sorts of stuff, and that doesn't really make for a great life either. You see? So balance is important. Survival, mastering survival, I consider that inescapable. If you think you're going to pursue Buddhahood while completely ignoring survival, and that the pursuit of Buddhahood will allow you to short circuit the need to learn survival, you're fooling yourself. In fact, if you can't master basic survival, then the chances of you ever waking up, I think, are pretty small. I would consider getting proficient at survival like a prerequisite even for the pursuit of serious spirituality, because serious spirituality is much more difficult than just learning how to get a job or developing a career or earning a bit of money or learning to socialize or learning some dating skills. So be realistic with yourself and remember that everything I said here is really a part of a deeper self-love. You're not going to reach the highest spiritual attainments through some sort of puritanical, moralistic guilt tripping of yourself. There has to be a deep self-acceptance, a deep honesty about your own limitations, whatever they are, your own cravings. You have to accept them, you have to love them, and only then can you transcend them. So try that on for size.